Hey, Tim Frisch with a Frisch Perspective here. I'm really excited because today I'm going to be sharing about a Bible translation that is definitely one of my favorites. So far I have talked about the New King James Version and the English Standard Version, so if you haven't seen those videos, you can go check those out. But today I'm talking about the CSB, the Christian Standard Bible, one of my definitely favorite translations. And before I get into that, I just want to encourage you to like and comment on this video and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, A Frisch Perspective. And if you would like to support what I'm doing, you can go on to Patreon and become a patron of this channel, and I would really appreciate that. So let's get into the topic of the Christian Standard Bible. I love to talk about Bible translations, and this is a really good one in my opinion. Now, the topic of Bible translations always raises a lot of questions and sometimes debate. I'm not going to solve all the debate today, but I do want to present for you why I think this is a good translation, why you ought to consider using it, at least as one of your Bible translations, and also just show maybe some of the downsides that even this translation has, because every translation has some downsides that you might want to consider too. So what is the Christian Standard Bible? Well, it's actually an update of the Holman Christian Standard Bible. The Holman Christian Standard Bible was actually developed by 100 scholars from 17 denominations, and it was completed in 2004. And according to Wikipedia, the roots of the HCSB can be traced back to 1984, when Arthur Farstad, general editor of the New King James Version of the Bible, began a new translation project. In 1998, Farstad and Lifeway Christian Resources, the publishing arm of the Southern Baptist Convention, came to an agreement that would allow Lifeway to fund and publish the completed work. Farstad died soon after, and leadership of the editorial team was turned over to Dr. Edwin Blum, who had been an integral part of the team. So what's interesting is that the HCSB was headed up originally by Arthur Farstad, or he was very instrumental in getting this translation going, and he was the one who actually was a main player in the development of the New King James Version, which is also one of my favorite translations. So thank you, Arthur Farstad, for your work in developing these great Bible translations. But as I said, this was completed in 2004, and they did do an update of it in 2009. But the big update came in 2017, where they really did an overhaul. They made some major changes, and you can actually watch one of my other videos where I talk about those changes, because in 2017, the HCSB became the CSB. Instead of being the Holman Christian Standard Bible, it's now called the Christian Standard Bible. And they did that, first of all, because they felt the name Holman Christian raised more questions than it answered. And so they wanted to name it something that would be more broadly appealing and understandable. So they just call it the Christian Standard Bible. They highly updated the text, and they gave it a new look. And you can see maybe a little bit the logo there. And when you get into the Bible here, there's another printing of the logo right there. So this was the 2017 update of the HCSB. Now it's known as the Christian Standard Bible. So the Christian Standard Bible, I recommend it partly and mainly because of its translation philosophy. And so I'm going to show a chart. This is a chart that shows the concept of optimal equivalence. And that's what they term their translation philosophy. And on the chart, what you see is that they're trying to balance both literal and getting the accurate meaning of the original languages with readable English. And so you can see that this is a translation that attempts to be the best at both sides of that. So there you go. And looking at the chart, you can see that the CSB is better than any other translation. The chart absolutely proves that. well, maybe the chart is just a little biased or coming at it from one perspective. But I will say that when you look at other translations, they have their different uses, but some of them, like the NLT, the New Living Translation, get so far on the side of thought for thought that you don't get as much accuracy to the original language. If you're really trying to understand the flow of the original language and some of the particular words that they're using. On the other hand, if you get overly literal, that can also make it hard to understand and be accurate actually to what the original is saying. So it is really important to have a balance. I do think that the literal translations have their place. Translations like the New King James Version and the New American Standard Version are definitely more literal, and I think that's really good for study. But as far as general reading or for reading publicly and using in church, I think the Christian Standard Bible is a really good translation. So on their website, they make this statement about their approach to translation. On the one hand, the CSB provides a highly accurate text for sermon preparation and serious study, translated from the biblical languages by scholars who love God's Word. On the other hand, it doesn't compromise readability and clarity for those who may be less familiar with the traditional and sometimes difficult vocabulary retained in some translations. So what you're seeing here is that the CSB really is a modern translation, and yet is still really trying to be accurate to the original languages. So I think that's great. The reason, though, that I say it's a modern translation, and I can show you another chart, is that other translations, as you see at the bottom of the chart, are based on existing English translations, and they've updated those existing translations and made new translations, whereas the CSB is going right to the original biblical languages, and they are translating it in a completely new translation. And so they also say on their website that because the CSB is an original translation, not constrained by the structures of an earlier English Bible version, it expresses the meaning and beauty of the ancient text with great clarity and emotional resonance. So that's what I would say is really good about the Christian Standard Bible, is that it is a translation that seeks to have optimal equivalence. And because it's a fresh translation, it really says it in a way that I think is both accurate but really resonates with us today. And a lot of people have found that when they read this translation of the Bible. It's really put in a way that you could say is our heart language as modern English speakers. And so, when you're reading people in the Bible, you really feel like this is someone who is just like us. They're humans and they talk the way we do. And so that's actually a good thing in many ways. Now, I think there's a place for those historic translations, and I still like to read the King James and the New King James and the English Standard Version, but I think having a modern, fresh translation is a really great thing as well. And if anything, for today, if I'm speaking to people that are not churched or I'm teaching, I really like using the CSB. So as you can tell, I'm gushing over it. I really like it. And Lifeway and Holman Publishers aren't even paying me to say this. I'm just saying this because this is how I really feel. But if they want to pay me for saying all of this, I'd welcome their support. Now, there are some downsides, just like I said with the ESV. You can always find some downsides, and these are just my opinion. But one of the downsides is because they didn't go with a literal translation all the time, you do get sometimes into murky waters as to how interpretive you're being. And one example of that is when Paul uses the term brothers. A lot of translations today will translate it brothers and sisters. And the Christian Standard Bible did that. Even though the term is more specifically masculine, Paul, the way he's using it, is talking about men and women when he says brothers in the church. He's really talking to everybody. And so they just translate that, instead of literally as brothers, they translate it as brothers and sisters. The problem, though, is then when you get into a passage like James chapter 3, verse 1, James says, "Not many should become teachers, my brothers." because you know that we will receive the stricter judgment. And the footnote there says, or brothers and sisters. But the question is, why did they only put brothers there when in other places they did translate it brothers and sisters? And so there becomes like an issue of consistency. So that's one of the problems with this translation, is maybe some inconsistency there in translation. I'm sure they had their reasons for doing that, and I hope we won't get into any big debates about it. But the point is, though, when you're not as literal, you have to make those judgment calls. Another thing, though, that's kind of related to that is how the Holman Christian Standard Bible, it translated things in a way that was really unique, and people actually liked it, but they were novel translations compared to other Bible translations. And so the update that became the Christian Standard Bible got rid of a lot of those novelties. And the problem with that is that they kind of sounded like they were going back on some of the things that they had said before in defense of how they had translated it. So an example of this is the word that in the HCSB is translated slave. It says in their notes that the strong Greek word doulos cannot be accurately translated in English as servant or bondservant. The HCSB translates this word as slave, not out of insensitivity to the legitimate concerns of modern English speakers, but out of a commitment to accurately convey the brutal reality of the Roman Empire's inhumane institution, as well as the ownership called for by Christ. So they're really saying that the best translation of doulos is slave, and that actually the word servant is not as good of a translation. And then in the CSB, lo and behold, guess how they translate the word doulos? They translate it as servant instead of slave. The very thing that before they said you shouldn't do. So there is that issue. They've gone back, and the same with some other things like the word for God, the name of God. Instead of translating it as Yahweh, which the HCSB did a lot, they just went back to the traditional thing that a lot of Bible translations do and just translate that as Lord with all capital letters, L-O-R-D. So there are a lot of people that really didn't like the fact that they changed that. And again, I have that whole video that shows the difference between the HCSB and the CSB. And some people say the update wasn't good, and so they actually want to stick with this HCSB. Other people like the changes that were made, but you can see that's kind of a downside to it too. Another update that they made that could be a downside is the issue of capitalizing divine pronouns. Now, actually, the original languages don't specify that there needs to be capitalization, and the King James Version doesn't capitalize divine pronouns. So it's interesting that some people make a big deal out of this. But the original Holman Christian Standard did capitalize pronouns for God. So if it referred to God as He, it capitalized the H. And in the CSB, they changed that and stopped capitalizing the divine pronouns. So it kind of actually went the route of the original King James Version, and there are other versions that do the same thing, like the NIV and the ESV. So, it's just a judgment call, and when they did the update, they decided to change that. But some people might look at that as a downside. And then probably the one other downside from some people's perspective would be the textual basis. Again, like I said with the ESV, it is not based on the Textus Receptus that was used by the King James translators. And so I think that for people that want the Textus Receptus, they really like the King James or maybe the New King James Version. And the HCSB did a lot of times include those phrasings or those texts, but they might put them in brackets, whereas the CSB just puts some of those things in the footnotes. And it uses more of the modern scholarship text. And so that's a good thing from some people's perspective, other people not so much. But as I've said before, I think it's good to have some translations that follow the Textus Receptus and others to be able to compare the difference because of these Bibles that we have now that are based on more recent scholarship and more recent archaeological finds. I think it's good to be able to have both kinds of translations. So those are just some potential downsides, but overall I have to say that I think that the Christian Standard Bible is a great translation. It's very accurate. I think a lot of people who've really studied it compared to the originals find it to be quite an accurate translation, and yet it's really well written in English for today. It's very readable. So it's a great translation, can be used in a lot of different settings, so I highly recommend it. So if you have any opinions about all this stuff, I'd love to hear your comments. Feel free to leave a comment. Tell me what a great job I'm doing, or if you have any feedback about anything related to this or any ideas for other videos, I'd love to hear that too. But thank you so much for watching this episode of A Fresh Perspective.